to episode 16 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. I'm your host, John Light, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Uber accounts for sale on the darknet, the Sustainable Economies Law Center's policy proposal for peer-to-peer home rentals, an update on the California Bit License Bill AB 1326, and last but certainly not least, Steve Waldman joins the show to talk about crypto asset valuation. Hello, and welcome once again to episode 16 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. Today's episode is brought to you in part by the OK Turtles Foundation and bitseed.org. The OK Turtles Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to supporting beneficial decentralization technology. Current development projects include DNS Chain, a blockchain-based replacement for the domain name registrars and certificate authorities that underpin all of the internet's security. The OK Turtles Foundation is going to be launching a crowdfunding campaign to fund the integration of DNS Chain with the OpenSSL library so that any program that supports OpenSSL can also support DNS Chain. Hint, that's a lot of apps. You can subscribe to the OK Turtles newsletter at okturtles.org to be alerted when the crowdfunding campaign begins, and donate to support the work of the foundation with Bitcoin, credit, or debit cards at okturtles.org/donate. Bitseed is selling products that support the decentralized internet. The company's first product is the Bitseed Bitcoin Edition, a plug-and-play Bitcoin full node that makes it super easy for developers to start developing Bitcoin applications and for regular Bitcoin users to support the Bitcoin network by running their very own full node. By running a full node on your own dedicated hardware, you not only ensure continuous uptime to support the network, but you also free up computing power on your desktop or laptop for other applications. You can order your own Bitseed Bitcoin full node at bitseed.org/shop. Big thanks to these organizations for supporting P2P Connects Us and working hard to create a more peer-to-peer world. You can also support this show by becoming a patron of the P2P Connects Us Patreon campaign. All patrons who send me a copy of their Patreon receipt along with a Bitcoin address from counterwallet.io are eligible to participate in my LT Bitcoin giveaway program. This past weekend, 38,469 LT Bitcoin and change were given away to 5 patrons of the P2P Connects Us Patreon campaign who sent in their counterwallet addresses. If you'd like to become a patron and participate in the giveaway, you can find the full details at patreon.com/P2PConnectsUs. I appreciate all the support I get from P2P Connects Us listeners and like to support you back. If you're working on a peer-to-peer project or use peer-to-peer philosophy or technology to improve your life, write me your story and I'll share it on the show so the audience can learn more about how peer-to-peer ideas can be valuable to them. Lots of great stories and interviews have been featured on the show thanks to input from the audience, so keep them coming. P2P Connects Us is also accepting original or open source content to publish on the website. I'm paying 50,000 LT Bitcoin for high-quality videos, 25,000 LT Bitcoin for audio content, and 15,000 LT Bitcoin for written articles. All original work that is published will be released under a copyleft license, so it's free to remix and redistribute as long as any derivatives or copies are also released copyleft. If you're interested in sharing your own perspectives on peer-to-peer philosophy, technology, and culture, please contact me through the contact page on my website at p2pconnects.us. You can follow the show on Twitter at P2PConnectsUs, subscribe to the P2P Connects Us YouTube channel and SoundCloud page, and sign up for email alerts each time new content is posted on the P2P Connects Us blog by entering your email address in the sign-up form at P2PConnects.us. With those announcements out of the way, let's move on to the news. Our top story comes to us from the Vice Motherboard, where Joseph Cox reports that Uber accounts are now for sale on darknet marketplaces for as low as $1 each. Motherboard obtained some samples of the accounts being offered and has confirmed that they are still active. It's still unclear where the data came from or just how large the breach was, but what is clear is that criminals can now use these compromised accounts to potentially defraud Uber and do harm to unsuspecting drivers. While the credit card information on the accounts isn't exposed entirely, the card can still be used to rack up Uber charges for as long as the account remains active. Other personal information exposed on the Uber profile can also be obtained by anyone who gains access to these hacked accounts. Stories like this serve as an important reminder that massive centralized databases can be vulnerable to both internal and external threats because they can be such valuable targets. This is also more proof that centralized authentication mechanisms are fundamentally flawed and should be abandoned in favor of offline two-factor authentication and decentralized cryptographic identity technology such as blockchain ID, OpenName, and similar systems. If you have an Uber account, consider resetting your password and checking your credit card statements for any unauthorized charges. At the same time as centralization is showing its weaknesses, some are advocating for even further centralization of the peer-to-peer economy. The Sustainable Economies Law Center, based out of Oakland, California, has recently called for public feedback on their proposal for city policies for short-term rentals. These are policy proposals for the short-term home rental market popularized by peer-to-peer home-sharing marketplaces like Airbnb and 9flats. The proposals center around a taxation and regulation regime which moves regulation out of the market and into the political sphere, moves that have already begun to be made by the city governments in San Francisco and New York City. The justification for such a move is spelled out in the closing paragraphs of the introduction section of the proposal document, which states, quote, "Cities already make policies and regulate markets in order to ensure fair access to vital resources. Cities protect access to affordable housing through planning, inclusionary zoning, and rent control, for example. Cities also attempt to steward the long-term vitality of neighborhoods and public spaces through zoning, nuisance laws, and public works. Cities even seek to recapture and spread the wealth brought by travelers by collecting a hotel tax and spending those funds on city improvements. Without such tools, a city's land, housing, and other resources could be disproportionately shaped by unregulated markets, privileging the highest bidders and concentrating wealth in the long term. With this in mind, short-term rentals should similarly not be allowed to operate in a completely unregulated market. A smart short-term rental ordinance would protect neighborhood livability and housing supply while providing income-earning opportunities to many who need them." Unquote. The SELC goes on to propose regulations such as restrictions on who can participate in these markets, a transient occupancy tax on transactions in these markets, and even suggests that governments in these cities should ban platforms like Airbnb and instead mandate that everyone use a platform run by the government instead. Well, in Seoul, South Korea, the government has completely taken over the ride-sharing market and banned any competitors. If the charges filed against 29 Uber employees in South Korea, as covered in the last episode, are any indication, such a ban could lead to arrests against peaceful people using and developing these platforms. I understand the concerns that the SELC has and can see how they would think that these proposals will address their concerns. But in making these proposals, they are not only ignoring the potential unintended consequences, but they are also ignoring or downplaying the most potent regulatory force of all, the market and the economic laws which govern it. Peer-to-peer platforms are microeconomies unto themselves, with their own sets of quote-unquote laws and regulations which govern how people interact with each other and what recourse is available if anything should go wrong. In terms of the impact that these peer-to-peer transactions have on the world around them, well, this should be of little concern to people who are not a party to these transactions unless someone's property rights are being infringed on. What these so-called unregulated markets are doing is optimizing resource allocation, and interference in this process would only harm, not help, local economies. On that note, there's a really good article that I recommend everyone who's listening to this check out online called Regulation Red Herring. It's a really great article and explains why a lot of these characterizations of these markets as unregulated are completely inaccurate. Just look, for example, at what government interference in the housing market in San Francisco has done so far. Rents are skyrocketing and now among the highest in the world. Evictions are increasing. Construction companies have their hands tied behind their backs and can't build fast enough. Renting is increasingly competitive and difficult, and almost everyone is suffering because of it. My advice for the SCLC? Go back to the drawing board and rewrite your proposals to advocate in favor of freedom and against mandatory regulations instead of for them. The sharing economy wouldn't even be where it is today if it weren't for the spirit of permissionless innovation and the brave actions of entrepreneurs and customers alike. By imposing mandatory top-down regulatory schemes on the peer-to-peer economy now, we might be preventing the next wave of sharing economy platforms from being developed and widely adopted in the future, and that would be a real bummer. You can read the SCLC's full proposal and leave them your own comments by clicking the SCLC STR discussion link in the show notes. Another proposal to regulate the peer-to-peer economy has been making its rounds, this one coming directly from the California State Legislature by way of a State Assembly member Matthew DeBabney. Assemblymember DeBabney has introduced a bill called AB 1326, which seeks to, quote, prohibit a person from engaging in this state in the business of virtual currency, unquote, without either a license or a special exemption from the state. As I mentioned on the last two episodes, I have started a petition on change.org petitioning Assemblymember DeBabney to withdraw his bill and further petitioning all current and future members of the California State Legislature to consider against introducing any similar legislation in the future. Since the last episode, the petition has been featured on the popular Bitcoin news website CoinDesk and has passed the 100 signatures mark. At the last San Francisco Bitcoin meetup, entrepreneur Terry Floyd, who is also a signatory to the petition, told the crowd that if AB 1326 is passed, he will have to stop selling Bitcoin through the Lamassu Bitcoin machine he has set up at the Nakamoto's shop at 20 Mission in San Francisco. I really appreciate Terry's bravery in speaking out against this bill and thank him for supporting the petition. It's stories like Terry's which should remind all of us in the Bitcoin community and society at large that regulations such as those proposed in AB 1326 have a real human impact and will hurt the economy if they are passed into law. If you support Bitcoin and would like to see the Bitcoin economy flourish in California, please sign my petition by clicking the Withdraw AB 1326 link in the show notes. For Let's Talk Bitcoin listeners, it's time for the magic word. The magic word for today's episode is market. That's M-A-R-K-E-T. Market. You have 1 week from the time this episode is published on letstalkbitcoin.com to redeem the magic word for your share of the weekly proof of participation points and LT Bitcoin distribution. Now back to the show. I would like to welcome to episode 16 of the P2P Connects Us podcast, Steve Waldman. Steve Waldman has one credential that really matters. He is an asshole. But there's a lot more good things to say about him. So Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Thanks for coming on. So just so people don't think that I'm the asshole for calling you an asshole, that just for context, that was apparently your biography at the most recent Ethereum Silicon Valley meetup. But all jokes aside, Steve, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into peer-to-peer technology?
Well, so I'm a longtime software developer who about a decade ago now sort of switched courses and spent a lot of time studying economics and finance. And my tiny hint of a claim to fame is that I write economics and finance at a blog called Interfluidity that has a certain amount of niche notoriety. And recently, my interest as a programmer and as an economist has always been collaborative decision making. How do large groups of people collaborate and come to make decisions for communities as a whole? And the crypto asset community or distributed consensus community, depending on how you want to look at it, is, from my perspective, a nice sweet spot between economic thinking, software, and the social theory of trying to get groups of people to collaborate well or create tools that enable people to collaborate well. So for the last year or so, I've become more and more involved in the cryptocurrency / distributed consensus community.
Cool. So what does peer-to-peer mean to you?
The lovely thing about the phrase peer-to-peer is that it connotes a kind of egalitarianism, is that instead of living in a world where we are going to organize ourselves into hierarchies and kind of be cogs in a machine, peer-to-peer suggests we're all going to be a little bit independent and we're all going to participate. And somehow we're going to make something collaborative happen by virtue of our flat participation. So that somehow is where the interesting stuff is, because we can all be a lot of peers, but there can be not much interesting happening between us. We can be atoms, or we can just be chaotic in ways that are uninteresting. But if we can get that connection to happen, that peer-to-peer, if we can find ways of being independent and egalitarian and still enable the kinds of collaborations that make our economic life and our social life and our political life work, that would be awesome. So peer-to-peer is a wonderful objective.
Yeah, we certainly share that opinion here at P2P Connects Us.
I guess so.
How did you first get interested in Ethereum then? It's obviously one of the more ambitious projects in the cryptocurrency realm, and at the same time, it can be a little bit confusing for people when they first come across it. So what drew you to Ethereum as kind of a solution to the problems that you've been talking about?
So Ethereum is the most straightforward platform for arranging kind of arbitrary, decentralized, distributed collaborations that's been suggested so far. It doesn't quite exist yet. Hopefully it will exist within a few months. But so I got interested in Bitcoin a little bit because, as an economist, it was interesting to see the alternative currency proposed. And as a human from where I'm coming from, I really like the idea of a distributed system, of relatively co-equal peers managing something like a payment system. But it's one application, and putting my sort of economist hat on, it's really a very flawed application in how it's arranged and the things that it claims that it wants to be able to do. So I got a little bit excited about Bitcoin, but not really all that excited. I was more excited by the architecture. And then, I found out about Ethereum, which was saying, look, we can take this architecture and make it a general purpose social computing platform. So instead of being stuck with, here's the, Bitcoin founder and developers idea of what a payment system or central bank might look like distributed, we can experiment with almost any kind of distributed organization. And so that really excited me. So Ethereum, I'm still, quite excited about the impending existence of Ethereum as a platform. It will be something that we can play with and experiment with. And lots of things seem possible, although there are, as we've talked about privately, there are some significant, hazards and pitfalls to the Ethereum architecture as well. But pretty immediately, once Ethereum comes online, it will be pretty easy for people with programming chops and not very elaborate. You don't have to be some crazy software engineer. People who can just kind of code a bit to experiment with decentralized organizational forms, to create tokens of value that are credibly managed by something other than the platform owner's database, which is an architecture I think we should try to get away from. So it's really an exciting moment with Ethereum, because if the platform, works as advertised and works well, which is a big if, it will really create a space for experimentation with decentralized but consequential social applications that hasn't quite existed before.
What are some of the social applications then that you would like to see tried early on with this kind of, generalized trustless computation engine?
In a way, there are too many. I mean, if you ask me what I want most, what I would really like to see evolve are organizational forms that can enter the political fray a little bit more, that can enfranchise people politically without taking the form of traditional political parties that end up becoming beholden to people, the party organizationally, and people who raise resources for the party. So I'm very motivated in large part by political concerns, by a sense that the society I'm living with is going badly awry, and we really need a kind of a democratic counter movement, but not a foolish one. We need some kind of arrangements or organizations that do a good job of aggregating the knowledge and interests of much broader publics into effective political action, that's smart political action, both from the perspective of being strategically effective and being good policy. So that's what I would love to see come from platforms like Ethereum. I think that's an ambitious starting point. In the nearer term, I would like to see, platforms, things like the Yelps of the world and the Facebooks of the world, which on the one hand are software applications that provide useful and important services to people that are decentralized in terms of the resources that they use. They require the collaboration and participation of lots of people to put them together. And yet all of that collaboration and participation gets controlled and monetized by a central organization that may or may not have incentives or may or may not have its heart in putting the interests of that community up front. But in the long term, it's just not a good architecture. Yeah. We really want an architecture where the people who are participating and contributing and building have some control over how that gets aggregated and over how their contributions get used, and some claim to some degree of appreciation, if not compensation, for their participation in the community, and so on. So I'd really like to see the kind of Web 2.0. This is cliche in the Ethereum community. I think it's Ethereum's Gavin, who coined the term Web 3.0, is trying to take all these Web 2.0 applications that are about being platforms that basically monetize the participation of lots of people, just analyze their data and aggregate and all of that, and giving the value of that back to the community and giving control of those platforms back to the community that actually creates the value. So that's, I think, the short-term, relatively straightforward project.
Yeah, and so this podcast, P2P Connects Us, is syndicated on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. And Let's Talk Bitcoin has a really interesting program that they call LTB Coin, where they do kind of what you're talking about a little bit, giving value back to the people who are co-creating the platform. Obviously, because we're still in a Web 2.0 kind of paradigm, the website itself is centrally hosted and managed, but they are taking steps to distribute some decision-making power and distribute some value back to the audience and content creators who are co-creating value on the platform. Are you that familiar with LTB Coin? And if so, what do you think about it right now?
So I'm not so familiar. We've offline had a couple of conversations about it, but I don't know all that much. But generally, I think this kind of experiment with using things like, private script or private tokens, by private's not quite the right word, community script or tokens specific to some particular group of people or application, is a pretty promising idea. And again, it's where I'm really hopeful that a platform like Ethereum will really be helpful, because it's not such a novel idea, right? We have air miles and reward points of various kinds that traditional merchants do. But again, the question of ownership, of who really owns the thing is pretty important. So I don't really feel all that empowered by the fact that I can, earn air miles from a credit card, or I don't feel like I'm participating in a community, because I know it's a marketing thing managed by the issuer, managed by an airline, and they'll mess with it. They retain the right to mess with those and devalue those and do whatever they need to do to maximize the benefits that they see that they're gaining from that. And I prefer to have the token than to not have it. I'd like to get a free flight sometime. But it's not really a profound change. So from what I understand about LTB Coin, it's already a little bit more ambitious than that, because it's trying to reward people not just for purchasing, but for contributing, right? So it's trying to reward people for making the network more valuable, for bringing people together, for blogging, for contributing, and so that's, right away it's a little bit more pro-social, but the sort of cynic in me says, well, that's great for now, but what if it really succeeded? The problem with a lot of these kinds of arrangements traditionally is catastrophic success. You see it in the Web 2.0 startup community. People start off incredibly idealistic and, great people in every sense of the world, but then they succeed wildly, and all of a sudden the things that they create offer a lot of opportunities for monetization, for marketing, for all kinds of things to happen. And all of a sudden, the character of what started out as very smartly arranged communal institutions changes, and we start seeing things corrupted by what's good for advertisers, or all of the subtle misbehavior that lots of us associate with Web 2.0 platforms.
Yeah.
So with something like LTB coin, the problem right now is that it's a great idea, but what if it succeeded really well and actually being the LTB coin issuer became really valuable? What would happen? Well, it's not that, the people are great, I'm sure. But the people were great with lots of, the Google guys, I think, were awesome when they started. I don't think as highly of them anymore. But that's not to say that there's anything wrong with them as people. It's that, when a lot of economic value converges on something, you really need solid institutions to prevent bad things from happening.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Corruption is not about bad people. It's about bad institutions. And so fundamentally, what moving something like LTB coin into a genuinely sort of peer-to-peer and smart contracty space is a way of protecting that kind of experiment from the consequences of potential success. And we should be really excited to have institutions that can stand to succeed, that don't always have to be marginal and experimental. That is exciting. And then the other thing that's exciting is that LTB coin is one experiment, but there's so many dimensions that you can vary, so many things to try. We've talked about some, things that might be done with LTB coin. With a platform like Ethereum, really a lot of flowers can bloom very easily. It'll be lots easier to create this kind of application than it is even centralized with a database.
Yeah. So I've talked about LTB coin before on the show, but for listeners who are just joining us, just for context, also to help the conversation going forward, the basic idea behind LTB coin is that the administrators of the LTB network, in particular Adam B. Levine, they have created a token of value on the Bitcoin network called LTB coin, which is given away to content creators on the platform, as well as people who participate in the online community. So commenting on different posts on letstalkbitcoin.com, commenting in the forums, providing moderation services, and otherwise contributing to value on the platform. And they specify all of the ways that you can earn LTB coin. You can find out more about that on ltbcoin.com. It's a fixed currency, so at some point the supply is going to taper off. It's a bit like Bitcoin in that way. And I believe it's going to be maybe 2 or 3 years from now that supply tapers off. Once it does, the only LTB coin that will be available to contributors is going to be LTB coin that is being paid to the platform for sponsorship opportunities. So advertising on the website as well as LTB network shows. So the value of LTB coin is effectively backed by demand for LTB network sponsorships and other services. Adam has mentioned to me that they're going to have a swap bot where you can exchange LTB coin for other tokens, and it will actually take LTB coin to run one of these swap bots if you want to run it yourself. He also has a couple other business ideas in mind, which he will be accepting LTB coin at a preferential rate in order to pay for those services. And so therefore the idea is that it will be economically advantageous to pay with LTB coin as opposed to any other token of value. With that context, Steve, your most recent presentation at the Ethereum Silicon Valley meetup was on crypto asset valuation. As I just described it, what do you think about the kind of incentives, short-term and long-term, that the LTB coin distribution and kind of valuation model will have?
Well, the first thing to notice is it sounds like it eventually wants to become the most basic kind of token, right? Which is an IOU1 token. So the network decides, however it decides, that you've made a contribution that deserves to be paid in some way, and they gave you a token. And what's that token good for? Well, that token, what you've just told me is that the token would be used to buy things like sponsorships and other services on the network. So the token is really just the network telling you, hey, you did a good thing for you, I owe you one. And someone gets a token, and if they want something that the network provides, they can redeem it back to the network effectively. They can give it back to the network, and the network will provide a service that the network can provide. And so that's a source of value, and the value of the token in terms of exchange value. So one way to get value from the token then is just to, well, I want to, some advertising or, some sponsorship from the network. So I'm going to just use my token for that directly. But another way to get value from the token would be exchange value. Well, I don't really need to have my name on the network, but somebody else might want that. So I'll sell the token to them and they can use it for that. And so the exchange value of the token will then depend in a pretty direct way on how much people value the services that the network can provide, that use value. So it's hard for me, I wouldn't be able to do a valuation analysis of the token. That would be like, trying to, and if the main service the network provides to people for the token is something like, sponsorship advertising, then it would be like an analysis, of the advertising value of those slots. And I'm sure there are lots of, advertising analysts who would be able to model, how much is this kind of sponsorship or this kind of commercial or whatever the service would be, how much is that worth? Mm-hmm. Once we modeled that in aggregate, once we found out, okay, well, the sponsorships are worth this much and there are this many tokens out there, then we can start thinking about what the use value of the tokens is. We can kind of put a floor on the use value of the token by kind of imagining that all the tokens are going to be used for sponsorships. There are some tricky things about thinking about how the flow works. What happens when the tokens are paid? Are they redeemed and disappear? Are they paid to other people? There are details in there, but fundamentally we have a basis for coming up with sort of fundamental valuation of the token once we find a source of value. That would be more of a floor than a ceiling because some people will hold tokens simply to hold them. And to the degree that people use tokens as a store of value, that tends to, in an unstable way, but at least for a while, at the margin be supportive of value. So we see that a lot with Bitcoin, where lots and lots of the Bitcoin issued is not made available for sale or not used in transfers. And the value of Bitcoin is higher than it would otherwise be if all Bitcoin that had ever been mined was actively circulated. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of a mistake to rely, for most tokens, to rely upon that kind of value as a source of value. It's the only reason to really bring it up is to say that the fundamental value is a kind of floor. Things can go up for speculative reasons and store of value reasons. As I mentioned in the talk, if I were the network, if the value of my tokens went very far above what I thought the value of my services could justify, if the application allows it, and I hope that it does, it's smart for token emitting applications to allow it, then the network should actually sell more tokens into the demand and use the proceeds of that to do things that will enhance the value of the network over time, right? Should think of the token as like a stock. When a firm's stock is very valuable, firms, if they're smart, and they think that value might be transient, they go on buying sprees. They issue stock to acquire other firms that offer assets to them that will increase the long-term value of the firm, rather than relying on a potentially unstable high valuation to keep their token valuable. They take that potentially temporary high valuation and convert it into permanent, real economic value generating assets that then support the token from the bottom, that increase its fundamental value. So that would be the kind of thing I would think that a network like LTB might try to think about and consider building into its model, so that, like a traditional business ought to do, the odd thing is that in the traditional finance, this notion of using the issuance of tokens, the issuance of stock in particular, as a way of raising funds on an as-needed basis, that's really the most fundamental idea of equity finance, but it's almost completely blocked by a kind of regulatory sclerosis. So really, public stock markets are not used to raise money. They're used to distribute money to people who were already claimants, or the people who bought stock from people who were already claimants before firms went public.
Yeah.
On net, public stock markets are distributing funds, not raising them. So in the crypto asset community, we really have an opportunity to kind of redo an understandable but lamentable historical path, where this idea of you generate value, people get excited about your tokens, and then you use that enthusiasm and that evaluation of the community that you might potentially be able to do something valuable to sell the tokens and purchase real assets that are going to turn your dream. Maybe people are just buying a dream, great, but you're going to turn your dream into something real and solid, a thing that creates economic value, and that requires real investment in, resources and humans and arrangements. Yeah.
So that it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a kind of way, where the high valuation might be ephemeral, but you convert that ephemeral high valuation into a sustainable long-term high valuation by, as you said, selling into the demand and then using that, newly invested capital to actually invest in things that will improve the long-term value and perhaps support that speculative high valuation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So I wouldn't want to say it's self-fulfilling, because most of the time it won't be fulfilled, right? Most businesses fail, and most great ideas, whether they just seem great and they're not really so great, or whether they're awesome but very difficult to execute. People will get excited about lots of things, and even if people are, selling and buying assets, they might make mistakes. There's never going to be any guarantee, and most speculative enterprises are probably always going to fail. But that's why, when we are on the other side of it, when we are investors or speculators, or we're just putting together our portfolio of things we want to hold, we need to be thoughtful about what, dreams we buy into and what dreams we don't. So hopefully the tokens that have those, real bouts of speculative enthusiasm are tokens for which at least the dream itself is a good one, a pretty good prospect. And then if that's the case, then selling into that demand might really be, as you say, fulfilling, make it possible to turn that dream into reality. But I don't think we should, fool ourselves to think that, just by committing to selling into demand and buying assets, we can make every token valuable. Lots of them will, people will be perfectly sincere and perfectly great, and they will sell into demand and generate a lot of money. We've already seen a bunch of token crowdfundings that have generated a lot of money, and that's great, and people will do something with it. And, if history is any guide, certainly more than 50% of the time, people will do their very best with that money, and it just won't work out.
That's a great distinction. I appreciate you making that clarification. Another thing that we discussed briefly was this idea of using demurrage as a way to maybe head off inflation in a token that's being issued. If the token isn't being issued forever, but instead it does have a cap in the way that LTB coin does, is demurrage as important, or do you still see a role for demurrage in kind of limited supply currencies?
Oh yeah, I see a role for demurrage, particularly in limited supply currencies. So the problem with a limited supply currency is that it really privileges people who get in early when they're cheap, right? So you say, I'm going to start a limited supply currency, and at any given moment, your limited supply currency, great, it's limited supply. There are only, 100,000 tokens out there, but it's today I just started it up. You can buy 100,000, you can buy 10,000 for $1. And then all of a sudden over time, whatever the application or collaboration or business or whatever it is that this token is going to be undergirded by actually succeeds. So sometime in the future, all of a sudden these tokens are really valuable. They have an important value. But early on, lots of really sort of cheap speculators who didn't do much contributing to the actual value of the enterprise just get, wildly rich for nothing. And you might say, well, okay, well, that's great. Why begrudge people their their luck, and that's
Well, it happens in the stock market too, right? I mean, early Apple investors might have just sat on their laurels and now they're, billionaires.
Yeah, so it certainly does happen. It happens in any market and in any financial market, any speculative market, and to a certain degree, that's fine. We want for people to be able to, it's okay for people to be able to get lucky and get rich, but it's also not really so fine if the things people get rich from are too disjoint from the things that people do to provide value. So in Apple's case, for example, Apple never issued a fixed token. And there was in fact, during the 1990s, a very significant possibility that early token holders would be entirely diluted out, right? So what happens with a traditional firm is when there's the event called bankruptcy and reorganization, the early token holders basically have their tokens devalued usually to nothing post reorganization. Apple has the right to continually issue shares if it wants to. Mm-hmm. It doesn't want to so much recently because it has so much cash, and it doesn't do it so frequently. It might do acquisitions from shares, but it doesn't issue shares for cash very much anymore because from a regulatory and also cultural perspective right now, issuing new shares for cash and secondary offerings is just not done.
Okay, so in that case then maybe you're saying the idea of shares in companies doesn't map kind of one-to-one to a fixed supply currency.
So, they're not fixed supply. And the important thing is, and they're not sort of the best thing in the world. The real early investors in Apple did supply a service that was really important, which is that they were willing to bear a lot of risk for something that at the time was totally, nothing. And certainly early token holders sometimes do that as well. And so there's a role for equity-like tokens that aren't issued very much in order to incentivize people to make, large bets early on with something. But most of the tokens that I think we're talking about, we're not really asking people to take large bets. The crowdfunding model early on is asking people to take small bets. And mostly what we want to do with the tokens, as I understand with the LTB token, right, is we want to encourage people to actually perform, to do things that add value to the network. So your primary role as a token receiver is not to be bearing an enormous amount of risk in exchange for a lottery ticket against fabulous wealth. That's one model, and it's an important model in the real world. But another model is to say, well, we're issuing tokens because we want you to actually provide value directly to our enterprise. And so we're going to pay you in tokens for the enterprise. And if that's your model, then this lottery ticket-like behavior is deeply counterproductive. Because as a new entrant, right, no matter what I do, I can contribute 1,000 hours of work to the network, but somebody who contributed 2 hours of work to the network in its fifth day is going to be rewarded lots more than I am. Mm-hmm. Right? And just by holding on to those shares and watching appreciation, it just doesn't well align the incentives of people to contribute with the rewards from contribution, to just kind of have a fixed value token and let people's reward be a matter of happenstance about at what price they purchase that token, right? So with something like Demirage, you can say basically, look, here's the deal. We want to basically pay people in tokens, and we know how much value we're trying to pay people. We want a certain contribution, say a blog post. We want to reward you for a blog post with something that pretty much matches the sponsorship value, or however we measure the value of the blog post. And we can put a dollar figure on it. We want to pay you something that's, worth, maybe $100 for that blog post. A nice way to arrange that is to try to stabilize the value of the token so that for the blog post, we're going to just pay you a certain amount of tokens, but that amount of tokens has a value that you can understand. Well, if you're constantly issuing tokens for new things, how do you support that value? Well, one way that you can support that value is you can say, look, and holders of older tokens are going to have to give up some of that value, right? We're going to actually take some of those older tokens away, or Demirage. We're going to, over time, fractionally decay older tokens to make room for new tokens to be more valuable. And the net effect of that is we're basically saying we value current contributions a little bit more than old contributions. So as you get a token, it starts out with a value, and you can sell it now, but over time that value is going to dissipate. So you might say, well, why would anybody ever hold a token that's going to evaporate forever? Well, that's where you really have to think about, does the token have some kind of value from holding? So if the token pays a dividend or something like that, right? If you distribute that fundamental value that gets created from the blog post, by issuing a dividend from sponsorships or whatever it is that you're using to generate some economic value, some exchange value from your network, well, then people hold the tokens not because they expect them to appreciate. They know actually their token's going to decay over time, but they're going to get a dividend stream that starts out high and decays over time. And it's that dividend stream that's going to define the value of their token. And so when you decide how much to pay for the blog post, you're going to put a value in that dividend stream and give them the dividend stream that maps to $100. And nobody gets screwed because everybody got paid exactly the value that they expected. And it's just that value gets paid with a stream of payments that starts out high and goes down over time. And the number of tokens remains fixed.
That's a really interesting idea, and there's a lot of things that I could say about it, but unfortunately we're out of time today. But I would love to have you back on in the future, Steve, to talk about crypto asset valuation and some of your other interesting ideas about how to use cryptocurrency and smart contract technology. Thanks a lot, Steve, for your time today, and we look forward to having you back on the show soon.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 16 of the P2P Connects Us podcast. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach me through the contact page on my website at p2pconnects.us. Until next time.